Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Productivity Mastery. My name is Stoyan if you're listening for the first time, and I just want to remind all our listeners if you've enjoyed an episode of Productivity Mastery previously, make sure to follow us, subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or any other podcast platform. That helps us a lot to bring you amazing people like my guest today, David. I'm bringing you a real treat, guys. Today is going to be legendary, and I can't wait to get into it. David, good morning in Texas. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
And you're having your cold iced coffee.
I got my iced coffee. Yep, my Nespresso pod. So
Love it, man.
ready to go.
So you've been in the industry of HR, performance, culture for over 20 years. Currently, you are a part of Flair as a chief people officer. Could you give us a bit of a context? What is Flair, and what brought you to the? Why did you decide to join Flair as opposed to any other company?
Yeah, great question. So I left my last company realizing I had been doing this for 20 years. So I've been leading people functions mainly in growth stage tech companies for the majority of my 20 years. And I was kind of starting to burn out a little bit, my last company. And I realized I needed a break. So I decided to sort of take a mid career break. I mountain biked, I took classes, I was exercising and didn't really know if I wanted to actually continue in this line of work or not. So I was on my break. I was in Moab, Utah, mountain biking, and I was doing all sorts of things that I wanted to do. And I'd been sort of getting connected with a couple of different CEOs who wanted advice, on thinking about their people function, or maybe they wanted to try and recruit me or what have you. And I wasn't really paying attention to it. But I got connected with two founders of a company called Flair, and I didn't really understand what it was to start. I didn't really understand what the company was doing. Now, at the same time, in that summer, 2 years ago or so, yeah, 2 years ago, I was dealing with a family situation. So my brother and I, we have a parent. One of our parents is going through, is kind of, has got dementia and then is sort of declining in mental faculties. And in our state of Arizona, where we grew up, and like many states in the United States, when you go through something like that, essentially it's a family law case. So you have to have guardianship. You have to sort of seek guardianship over an elderly parent. It's a legal situation. And these co-founders, when they reached out to me, I didn't realize it at first, but then it clicked for me that what they're building is a legal tech company. So Flair is a legal tech company. And really, it's about it creating technology and a platform to connect clients of family law with lawyers currently in 10 states and probably will grow. But they connect those individuals, the clients who really have a hard time finding the right lawyer for them, don't understand how the law works, don't you really use technology with their lawyers typically. And then the lawyers who, do a lot of sort of pen and paper and sort of traditional like filings with county law firms, they don't really use the technology, or they don't have technology they need to find the clients. And so Flair's legal tech company created like a two-sided marketplace to connect clients with lawyers, and then they go through the entire case through this platform. And when I realized what they're trying to do and sort of disrupt this space and trying to create a much better experience for clients and attorneys, it kind of felt like kind of kismet. It felt like serendipity. It felt like this is my next thing. So I've been there for about a year and a half now.
So this is something that you cared about, something that you can connect to, and of course that has a bigger motivation for you to contribute to make it successful.
100%. I think about our clients, people going through family law matters, guardianship, divorce, family law matters, really tough life events, emotional life events. I think about our clients every day. As a chief people officer, I think about how can we better serve our customers, and our customers also include the attorneys themselves, who are a special breed. If you want to do family law as a profession, you're a special individual, and like, so trying to help them is a big motivator for me. And I think it's a big motivator. We talk about mission alignment in the company. And so the topic of your podcast, Productivity Mastery, a lot of it for us is around making sure we have mission alignment internally, the people that we're bringing in. And day to day, whether you're the product team or you're in the operations team, you think about our mission constantly as a way for sort of better outcomes and better productivity.
I love it, man, and I can't wait to dive into it. But I thought it's gonna be fun to, since you have such an impressive background, David. I mean, we're gonna go through the companies now, but 20 plus years of a career of leading roles in HR and people departments. And I wanted to start with a question so we can give a bit of a context to the audience of If we can go through each of your latest employments and companies, and you can maybe provide one quick reflection. So I will name a company you were a part of, and you will tell me what was your role there, but what was one thing you learned about people management and performance from your experience in there. So I'm going to start from Universal Pictures.
Okay, yeah, gosh, well, a long time ago. Um, we all have companies and situations where we learn what not to do. So, I think my time at Universal was mostly learning about what not to do. What I mean by that is the movie business is incredibly ego driven, and so there's a lot of ego on the movie sets. But interestingly, Universal Pictures was acquired by GE, General Electric, a big industrial, a very old, long tenured company. And so imagine a industrial manufacturing company trying to foist performance management, what they called Session C, trying to foist a industrial manufacturing performance management philosophy on a movie studio business. It really didn't work. It really, having the head of the studio call in from New Zealand where they were filming King Kong to try and talk about the performance of their team. That in that type of business, they're visionary, they're creatives, they shake hands on a movie set. And you have to understand performance. You have to understand what good looks like in a creative setting, much different than what you would do in an industrial manufacturing setting. So I learned what not to do at Universal Pictures.
I love it, man. That's such a great point. If we don't learn some good practices, we can learn what not to do. Okay, I'm continuing with EA, Electronic Arts.
Electronic Arts, one of my best experiences in terms of being around, HR leaders who are really fantastic. People like Colleen McCreary and Steve Cadigan and Jeff Ryan and Gabby Toledano. These are people who have gone on like just such great careers in HR. But what I learned there, actually, I call out one leader in particular, Roxanne Lucas. She was my boss. She talked to me about relationships and in relation to performance. And a relationship being a three-legged stool. Think about a relationship you have with a coworker at work, as the three legs of the stool are trust, respect, and communication. And that really sort of, maybe sounds simple, but the idea that you need those three things to have a relationship, and then relationships or behaviors are basically 50% of your performance. And so that relationship model from Roxanne was huge for me.
Beautiful. So we continue with Twitter.
Twitter, yeah, gosh, my Twitter time. There was, I think, when I started, my boss, Janet Van Heijs, I think there was maybe just 4 people in the HR team at that time, but they had like 100-person recruiting team, so it was a very small HR team. But Dick Koslow, the CEO, wanted to work with the HR team to create a management training. And typically, my experience up till then was, well, you have to buy something. You have to buy management training. You have to invest a lot of time and dollars, and sort of work with psychologists to create. And he just started creating notes. He started creating notes. And in fact, Kim Scott was part of this early on. So Kim Scott from Radical Candor, she was sitting in with us, sort of talking about these concepts of like, clarity, and which became Radical Candor. But what I learned at Twitter was that you can actually create management training from scratch. It actually doesn't take a lot. You can create clarity for your managers on what good looks like, and you can walk through in conversations with no slides. You can have conversations. You can have a couple-hour conversations over 2 days around what you want to see from them, and have a conversation about it. And that creating management training from scratch, ideally with your CEO in lockstep with you, was a really powerful model for me at my next step at Twitter and later on in my career.
And later on, you moved to Zendesk.
Yes, so Zendesk right after that. So Zendesk, the CEO at Zendesk at the time, Mikkel, really kept everything personable and approachable. So I think sometimes in HR organizations, we're prone to corporate jargon. We're prone to sort of corporate speak, and we like to get fancy with our terminology. And so with the customer, he talked about the customer goals as transparency, responsiveness, and empowerment. And he wanted to keep it really simple. And he actually had a model at the time with customers called relationships are complicated. And so a light bulb moment for me, kind of came out. I remember going to an offsite, and so we're trying to think about our sort of leadership philosophy and what we're trying to do from a people perspective. And I just said, that's it. Transparency, responsiveness, empowerment. The same thing we're trying to do with our customers is what we want to see our leaders do. That we want to see them foster transparency, responsiveness, and empowerment in their teams. And so, but that idea of keeping things personable and approachable, not only with our customers, but with everything we're doing in the people function, with the people that we serve, the managers and leaders and employees, was a model for me.
Mm-hmm. All right, moving on to Niantic.
So Niantic was a Google spinoff. So it was a team that did it does, but at the time they did geolocation stuff. They were early in the Google Maps. That tech team was Google acquired a small team that became Google Maps, and the CEO John Hanke and his team created this, kind of this technology that allowed, eventually became Pokemon Go, allowed for you to play a game. You can walk around and play a video game, Pokemon Go. And so what I learned at Niantic, though, there's this gravitational pull for teams, particularly if a team is like, hey, we all came from Google, or we all came from Electronic Arts, or we all came from Twitter. Inevitably, that team will want to do everything they did at their prior company. They'll want to replicate everything we do on performance management, on how we do promotions, on how we calibrate in teams. And I saw that not working. I saw that not working in terms of hey, we don't have to do everything we did at our prior company. So I found myself having to challenge at times, sort of an approach I want to take in performance or productivity or management. But you have to be mindful of that in terms of the people where they came from, in terms of what they're bringing in, and sort of their perspective, their lens on the world. But a powerful thing for me at Niantic was remembering your customer. So we had these customer stories about how just playing Pokemon Go allowed people to reconnect with their kids, allowed them to challenge, sort of get more comfortable with agoraphobia, to actually explore their communities. And that was a powerful reminder of what we were doing and what we're about. Much how I sort of think about my role at Flare now in terms of the mission. Back to everything in terms of building the culture.
All right, and the last one I'm going to mention is Eventbrite.
I'll keep this one simple. We had a learning at Eventbrite that as a startup that went public, we, like many startups, got enchanted with the fancy objects. So we were constantly changing our focus, which led us to have a lot of activity. And so everyone was really busy. Everyone's in a lot of meetings, and we're constantly scrambling. And that can look like, wow, we're busy. Busy is good. Like we're scrambling all over the place. We're trying to do lots of stuff. And then you realize, hey, we didn't have any impact. We were so scrambling. Our focus was so all over the place. This past quarter, we had no impact. We didn't move the needle on the sort of core metrics. And so Julia, the CEO, just kind of during the middle of COVID, came up with this saying called impact over activity. We have to focus all our efforts on impact and not get enchanted with the idea of activity being some sort of signal to us of good things. So impact over activity was a learning.
Right. We are doing so many things, so we should be productive, but it's not the case, right? It's if there's no impact, if there are no results in the direction we want to go, then we're just wasting resources.
Yeah. You could see someone you could look at their calendar and they're in meetings all day, left and right, boom, boom, boom. And then you could look at this person and, well, they have a lot of free time on their calendar. Who would you assume is the more productive person? Who would you assume is the person who is actually generating more results? The person who's in meetings, back to back, or the person who doesn't look like they have a lot of meetings in the week? And I think oftentimes we get enchanted with that person who's so busy. But the reality is, what do you get done in a meeting? What do you get done if you're in meetings? You actually get nothing done. If you're an engineer, you get nothing done if you're in a meeting all day. Everything you get done is outside of that. All of your big unlocks, your sort of discretionary output, your bright idea that you can execute upon is when you have quiet time, alone time. And that idea of being in meetings is actually a drag. So organizations have to be really conscious about how much time they're in meetings. This is another thing at Eventbrite. I started evaluating how much time we were in meetings, how much time engineers were in meetings, and how we could actually pull back and free up some time. So that idea of just being busy is actually not a good signal for being productive.
Absolutely. And we have some people tuning in live. So I'm just going to read a comment. And I want to invite everybody who's listening live to this podcast. Feel free to post your question in the comments. We'll take some questions. But Nicole, thanks for being with us. She's mentioning impact over activity. That's a fantastic summary of what matters. Meetings mean nothing without outcomes and action. Thank you so much, Nicole, for being with us. Again, feel free to post your question in the comments. And I wanna dive into the topic of today. And just for transparency, David and I had a call a couple weeks ago, and I mean, you guys heard 20 plus years of experience condensed in 7 minutes. I mean, this guy's an encyclopedia with having so much experience. I have so many questions, and I was trying to figure out what would be a great angle. What can we talk about? And David suggested, how about we talk about this topic: a team of high performers versus a high performing team. So, David, I'll just let you maybe first give us a context, what inspired you to propose this topic, and then kind of unpack the topic for the audience.
Sure. Yeah. This was inspired by a post from a colleague, AJ Thomas. She asked this question on LinkedIn: would you rather have a team of high performers or a high performing team? And when she posed that question, what I had been thinking about at the time was all our traditional sort of perspectives on performance management in companies, performance management from a chief people officer lens. We have performance systems. We have employee reviews. And so I've been troubled by, in my 20 some odd years, this notion that, like, every time I go through a performance cycle, I have no idea whether, even if we did it perfectly, and regardless of whether we do reviews twice a year, 4 times a year, we do them, we have a rating or we don't have ratings, we use this tool or that tool. No matter what iteration I've had in my career, sort of doing it perfectly, like, wow, we did this flawlessly. And at the outcome of it, did we move the needle on the company, on the company performance at all? Do we know how, what the sort of outputs of this are? I saw a quote from, I think, David Rock the other day. It said only 2% of chief people officers believe that their performance management system actually helps company performance, which was crazy to me. I started thinking about this in terms of, like, you have to. I think we should have reviews. Manager and employee should sit down regularly. So not just once a year, but they should sit down regularly, and a manager should have a conversation with the employee and give clarity on how they think they're doing, and the employee should give clarity to the manager. That's so our performance systems govern that conversation. So it's important. But in this a team of high performers, what I'm about as a chief people officer, I want to see the company generate high performance. I want to create a high performing culture. And what I think about the company's high performance at the company level, I think about engineering and sales and design and product. And these are teams that are working with each other. The go-to-market teams are working with the R&D teams to generate results for their customers and ultimately their shareholders. And so you create greatness in teams. No matter how many high performers that you have in the design team, you could have a design team that, like, hey, out of a performance system, the performance management cycle said that as a percentage of high performers in the company, design is the highest performing company. What do you mean by that, David? Well, we looked at percentage of people who exceed expectations in the performance system, and design came out on top. And the CEO says, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. We're a design-centric company, but we all know the design team is the team that's struggling the most. So why would we say that? And then I realized, well, that's because that person is thinking about each designer in isolation. And so the team, how the team is doing, how they work together as a team, I kind of think of the analogy of a symphony. I could have a bunch of virtuoso violinists in the string section. Like, wow, in isolation, that violinist is fantastic. They're a virtuoso. That violinist is a virtuoso. But then get them together, and, like, you just know immediately as the conductor, they're making horrible music together. They are not in sync. This doesn't make any sense. And it's affecting the whole rest of the symphony. Or you take another analogy of a sports team, and, like, wow, they each have individually great stats, but we're not winning. We're not winning as a team. And so back to that question that AJ posed, would you rather have a team of high performers or a high performing team? Obviously, I think you want a high performing team. And I think you have to think about how we assess that. And it's not your performance systems. It's not your traditional performance management system. The reviews, the reviews that you're doing, individual reviews. I started thinking about this at Eventbrite. We actually, I can talk about this, but we actually started doing something. We basically did team performance reviews. We stack ranked our teams at Eventbrite. And it was really interesting. It was interesting in terms of what were the teams that actually came out on the higher end of the stack ranking amongst the executive team. And then what were the teams that came out on the low performing side? And it was completely not correlated at all with the performance reviews. And then we started talking about, why is this? Why is this team over here and that team over here? Then we generate a rubric. Like, well, what does great look like for a team at Eventbrite, or great look like for a team at Flare? And you have a rubric, and it might sound like has some similar things that you would also want from employees, but that evaluating that team then becomes really about what they're doing together and what they're doing and who they're serving. And so we did stack ranking at Eventbrite, and we're doing team performance reviews at Flare. And it's been like mind blowing to me in terms of the outputs. So when you have a sort of an output of like, this team is performing really well, this team is not performing well, it's actually not always about the people. So in a performance review, it's about the individual and their results and their behaviors. But in a team setting, it's about, well, why is this team not performing well? Is it about the people? Is it about the leader? Is it about their strategy? Is it about what they're focusing? Is it about resourcing? Have we not set this team up for success? And so what you can do with that, in terms of, as a chief people officer, I have all these bullets now, and we can work and sort of build a plan to get this team, which is central to our strategy, to performing to expectation, and maybe even exceeding expectation. And so I'll stop there, but it's been really mind blowing for me. Back to AJ's question, and sort of like what we should be doing as chief people officers and how we can impact the company performance.
Oh, I love it, man. I won't let you stop because I want to dive deeper into that. You talk about these bullets, and maybe we can start from there. Ambiguous assessment. In order to improve something, you wanna do a proper assessment, and you mentioned all those bullets. Can we just maybe share what are, in your perspective, those bullets? What are the pillars that we need to pay attention to in order to set the ground for a peak performing team to evolve?
Well, I think you have to get to a perspective around what is a high performing team, what's low performance, what's high performance. So the first thing to addressing a problem, or to actually sort of creating strength, is to understand what you're looking for. And I think for a lot of organizations, it might be at ground zero. Like, yeah, what is a high performing team for us as a company? And we might have, as an executive team or a larger leadership team, we might all have different perspectives. This person who's coming from this company might believe, it's all about elbowing people out of the way. It's all about us. It's all about like what we can do at the expense of other teams. It's all about like competition with other teams. But this person over here, this leader, might think very differently. Might think it's all about negotiations. It's all about sort of consensus building. And so you have to work through that. You have to work through these different perspectives to create clarity. And it's going to maybe a little bit different for this company versus that company in terms of what do we think is a high performing team. But ultimately, it's a rubric. It's a set of like descriptions of like, you know it when you see it. Well, what does it look like? Describe it to me. Create 5 bullets, for me, around work ethic, around output, around collaboration, around impact. So that you create that clarity, what they're doing, what a high performing team is doing, and what they're not doing. And then also what it looks like at the low performing side. So I think that's one of the first things you have to get to in order to really measure, in order to have like fidelity of your measurement. And then you can start measuring. And then, I think a big challenge that many companies struggle with today, which I think we were going to maybe get to, and I'll just sort of go there, on creating high performing teams, is we have no idea like what the high performing teams are. We have no idea. And so traditionally, I think what I've seen organizations do to really measure each team is that they have a complicated set of metrics for each organization. So meaning like there's this term called monthly business reviews or quarterly business reviews, where the business unit or the function presents. They present to the CEO and executive team and say, hey, everyone, here's how we're doing. And each company presents, each team presents different metrics. So the sales team might come in and talk about, funnel conversion. They might talk about bookings. They might talk about, I don't know, all sorts of functionally specific things. and they curate it, and then maybe it changes month to month. Like, hey, now we're actually going to focus on this. Don't worry about that other thing we said last month. Now this thing is what's important. And so I think this is a challenge that companies will struggle with in terms of, measuring. Once we have the rubric, how do we measure what the high performing teams are? My hypothesis is you should probably still do all those things. You should have metrics that are specific to engineering and sales, like, sort of velocity and sort of, bugs and sort of percentage of bugs in the system and sort of downtime, all sorts of stuff. But to get to like simplicity, I think you want your leadership team to talk to each other. The leadership team who represent, I oversee this team, I oversee this team, and we work together. We don't work in isolation. We want their perspectives around of the teams that you work with, that you depend upon. Tell me which teams are performing well, which teams are struggling versus what you'd expect of them. And I might not work with every team, but I work with, let's say, seven. I work with 7 of the 15 teams at the company, and I'll give you my perspective on those. So my perspective will be relevant to the teams I work with, but then I can give you, an output. And with a simple question, a very simple question: what teams are doing well, what teams are not doing well, and then why? So if I said, I think this team is the highest performing team of the teams I work with, well, why? What are they doing? Give me an example of something that you're observing. And then for the teams that are struggling, what's lacking? Why do you have them on this end of the spectrum in terms of they're not performing? What are you observing? And then ideally it lines up with the rubric, but I think the outputs of that then become really your levers and your goal. But those struggles, back to why it's what the struggles are and what I think leaders should be thinking about is the rubric. First of all, like what do we expect? What do we want from our high performing teams? And that's a lot of work too, just to getting to clarity. That's a lot of work to sort of honing that and getting alignment on that. And then you can measure it. And my hypothesis is keep it simple.
I love you mentioned the word alignment, and we had this discussion prior to the podcast as well. One of our guests on the podcast is a movie cinematographer. He's a Hollywood guy. His name is Shane Hurlbut, and we talk about productivity. And he was sharing lessons from the movie. He's one of the big guys at DOP in Hollywood, and I it still stuck with me this metaphor he mentioned, because I asked him about what are his challenges as a director of photography. Just to give you a context, he would have up to 250 people just in the camera department on movies like Terminator Salvation, Need for Speed. And when I asked him, what are your biggest challenges on set? He said, my biggest challenge as a leader is to make sure that every person on my team is making the same movie.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what a great metaphor, man. You're talking about alignment. And maybe we can start from there, because again, you've been in so many companies, you've been leading many people, teams. I wonder, what are the first steps for the leadership in terms of creating this alignment?
Great question. Super timely for us too, because I think organizations that change, and every company is constantly changing. Companies that have had to go through layoffs the past year, companies that are suddenly going like really all in on AI, let's just say, you're changing. And so if you have multiple layers in a company, it's probably even harder, as a 1,000 or 10,000, person company versus 100, because you have these layers. You have people who are still working off of old news, right? You have people who like, hey, my boss told me at the start of the quarter, I was supposed to focus on this. And so that's what I'm doing. And that person has this lag, this delay of what I was told previously. And then the executive team is sitting there contemplating, they're looking at the numbers and like, we got to make some changes here. We got to change things. Or the CEO's got an idea of like, hey, my vision, I have a light bulb moment here. We got to start moving in this direction. And so then there's a strategic shift. And so the alignment and sort of having alignment is constantly elusive and constantly important. And so I'll give you an example of something I did recently that maybe is interesting for others. As a chief people officer, I'm thinking about this alignment around our strategy as a really big part. I need to have a crystal clarity on this relative to creating high performing teams. I need to make sure what we're focused on. I make sure I can kind of repeat it back to people I'm talking to. And so I sat down you have a leadership team, there's like 12 to 15 people, and then you have an executive team, it's like 5 people. I sat down with all our leaders recently and I asked them 2 questions. I asked, what do you think is the most important thing for us to accomplish in the next 1 to 2 years. And then I asked, what's the most important skill that we need to accomplish that we're currently lacking? And I got all these notes. It was a great conversation. And I got all these notes and I put it in a document, those 2 questions. And then I ran it through AI to summarize across all these, 12 to 15 questions. And I got the AI summary of our most important objectives from the leadership team. So this is the next level of leaders. And I also got the skill answer. And then I shared it back with the executive team. And there was kind of these reactions around like, wow, there's a lot of alignment, but what's this one thing? Why are they talking about this one thing here? We didn't say that. That's not what we're not focused on. Where did that come from? And then you have this light bulb moment for the executive team, where they say, okay, we need to work on our story. We need to make sure there's something here that there feels like we're misaligned on, and we need to hone in on that. We need to hone in on these are our priorities, and this thing is no longer a priority. Because alignment and strategy, what our strategy is not only about what we're choosing to do, what we're not doing. And so having clarity on what we're doing, but what we're not doing becomes, in my view, on alignment, where the hard work is. It's easy to say what we're going to do. It's like, hey, we're going to do this and this and this and this. But what we're not going to do oftentimes is the hard part. That might be the controversial thing. That might be the sort of like, yeah, we need to not do that anymore. And there's implications to that. We've got people working on that, but we've got a whole team working on that. And you're saying we're no longer, what does that mean? Are we having to cut that team? Are we having to sort of redirect them to other things? Like, that's the hard part around alignment, is what we're not going to do.
So what we're going to do, what we are not going to do, and then going down the ladder. So every team, every department comes up with how could the team contribute and make an impact to achieve this vision, to make sure that this strategy is achieved.
Yeah. I think there's in your strategy, in your alignment, ultimately the muscle you're trying to build is storytelling. So I think there's vision, strategy, and goals, right? So the vision, that's the mountaintop. That's 2 to 3 years. That's where we want to be. It's always elusive. That's great. That's motivating. Your strategy is about what we're doing, what we're not doing, and when, specifically how we're sequencing these things. And then the goals are like this quarter, this month, in these 5 to 10 person teams. The manager of those teams, that's where they're living and breathing. They're living and breathing in the day to day, the week to week, my goals. And so I need to know the strategy so I can kind of work on my goals with my team. And there becomes an element of trust. So once I convey the vision and once I convey the strategy, I have to trust them. I create a sort of simple framework, like, hey, let's sit down and sort of create goals and make sure each individual feels like they can see how they line up, and they're having conversations around like, hey, I don't have a skill on that. How do I fit in here? What do we do with that situation? But there becomes an important element of trusting your managers to actually, once they understand the story, to sit down and align objectives, the sort of the daily, the monthly goals to that strategy.
And we live in a world today that's super turbulent. Things are changing. It's very dynamic. I would imagine there's so many changes happening, and you guys have to make adaptations, changes to the plan, to the strategy. So what I'm hearing is, as leaders, we need to create effective communication channels and strategies so that when there are changes happening, it can efficiently, effectively be communicated to everybody. How do we do that, David?
Yeah. So I like take a company where what we do is not going to change very much. We make widgets. We're a 100-person company. We've been around 100 years, and we're not changing. So maybe a different challenge. They're constantly working in the margins, constantly trying to optimize. But a growth stage startup, where what we're trying to do, there's really no other company has done what we're trying to do. We're pushing on something. We're adopting AI. It's never been done before in this customer experience. And so your change is like, we think this is the strategy. We think this is right. But to your point, there's going to be constant change. We learn something. Hey, that didn't work. And so we have to adjust. And so I think there's big changes and there's little changes. Little changes are course corrections throughout the quarter. We need to spend less time on this and a little bit more time on that. We need to actually deprioritize this one thing because there's someone left, and so we now no longer have the resource to actually accomplish that. So we're going to course correct a little bit. Then the big changes are more strategic shifts around sort of, hey, we're actually going to pursue a completely different direction with a customer. We're going to pursue a different marketing strategy. I think, in either sense, what you in a growth stage startup, the sort of the clarity and the concreteness, if that's a word, of our direction, you have to be more comfortable with the changing, but also you have to be oriented towards learning. So what I mean by that is we set this as a direction. We said these were the accomplishments. This was the product roadmap for this quarter. We launched some things. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. Startups like to move on. They like to just sort of like, hey, we did a bunch of stuff. Remember impact over activity? We did it. We accomplished it. Let's move on. Well, did it work? Did the thing that we said we were going to do for the customer, did it move the needle, on our customer retention, on the net promoter score? Did it drive more organic growth? What happened? Startups like to move on. Doing postmortems feels like a chore. It feels like, hey, might also feel sensitive, because there was someone who led that initiative, and like, what if it didn't work? What if it actually didn't move the needle? That kind of feels, that could be deflating. So we want to stick put our head in the sand sometimes on our initiatives. So on change, and whether it's big changes or little changes, I think in growth stage startups, you have to get comfortable with learning and build rigor around it. And rigor in a startup is a bad word. That's like, we want to be fast moving and sort of nimble, and just sort of not have a post-mortem and go through a process to learn and sort of share out those learnings and communicate. We don't want to have a structured, product, roadmap or whatever. And so that thing on change for me in startups, where you're kind of pushing, you're going to be changing a lot. You have to get comfortable with learning and sharing out those learnings, building a learning organization. This is something at Twitter that we struggled with. We just, I remember our COO at the time, Ali Rogani, asked the executive team, like, what were all the big things that we did in the past year? And he just started whiteboarding all these things. People were just like throwing out like all these things that we launched. And okay, now like, which of them worked? Like, what do you mean, which worked? Like, which of them had a positive impact? And what do you mean by positive impact? Just tell me, which of these are we proud of? And it was interesting how we struggled with that, but we also struggled with, what do we learn from them? The question on what do we learn? Take any of these, what do we learn from it? And so, there was a guy, I think his name was Peter Senge, and he was popular at Pixar in terms of building a learning organization, building a culture of learning and learning orientation. That's something startups struggle with.
Yeah, there's a great book, Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, where he's sharing some of those practices, like the brain trust that they were creating, and all these kind of other practices that help us to sustain the learning. I interviewed the CEO founder of PixArt, not PixArt, the video collage kind of company, more than 1 billion downloads, unicorn company. And he told me, for creativity to happen, you need to create experimentation, culture of experimentation, but also you want to collect the learnings. And he gave an example. For example, if there is a team A and they decide we should do test whether this button should be blue or red, and do the A/B testing, whatever, then we want to have infrastructure where we keep this learning, so somebody from the other team will see, we already tested with button that's red, doesn't work, let's do the blue one. So he said they are investing quite some resource into creating this structure where they can keep the learnings, so we don't have to do the same mistake many times over.
Yeah, I think structure on how we learn as an organization, it's really important, and we kind of just we think learning just happens. I think you just sort of assume that we are learning. We assume that like we're all picking up on this. We talked about it, and we assume that we learned. We assume that the learnings are making its way through the organization, and they don't. They don't without some level of structure or methodology for how we actually capture these and then share them out. But also, then what do we do with the learnings? So once we've learned this worked, this didn't work, or we capture something more abstract about it, what do we do with it? And then, do we overreact to the learning, or do we just say, okay, let's continue to ponder this. Let's do something, similar, but, just have that in our back of our mind. So what you do with the learnings is also important.
I mean, look, I'm on the other side. I'm a consultant. I often get brought into a company to help a certain team to upskill, like people skills, leadership, communication, productivity, you name it. And often this is something that when I get into individual conversations, private conversations with employees in companies, they would share with me that they don't want to be creative and try out new things because the culture they're in, they're kind of afraid to make a mistake because then it's going to be on them. So they rather stay in the safe space. Oh, this is what
Hmm.
I've been given to do. I'm not going to try to come up with this new idea because if it doesn't work, then it's on me and I'm afraid. So part of it is also to create a safe space for people to, if they learn, they probably make mistakes. So they have to be feeling safe that if they prepare for a certain project and to certain thing to happen, they're not going to be judged if they did their best, if
Yeah.
they prepared and follow the methodology, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and it's harder too for more mature companies, companies that scale, to experiment. You're going to get resistance. You're going to get resistance. Not only am I fearful of what's going to happen, because there's a lot of people around me, but also, people are going to say, we've already done that. We've already tried that. Like a company with 100 years history or 100,000 employees. You kind of lose your hope, you lose your steam to try and experiment, do something new because there's constantly getting resistance. I remember, it's not on my resume, but my very first job out of school was Shell Oil, really big old oil company. And I remember I was just trying to draft up a promotion announcement for someone who was promoted. And then someone in the Netherlands heard I was drafting up a promotion announcement for someone. And they said, "Hey, we already have a template for promotion announcements. Just use this and put the person's name in there." I'm like, "Are you serious?" And so, so there's resistance, but yes, there's also companies having to create a space. Like, how do we actually experiment? How do we do A/B tests? Like, in what sort of way, do we have room for people to experiment? We do a hack week. We kind of we say 70% of your effort needs to be focused on expected goals, but we want 30%, sort of your own ideas or something like that. There has to be sort of structure and space. What are sort of okay experiments versus experiments like, hey, we're not okay with experimenting with stuff that's going to affect the customer's finances or something like that. You have to create that clarity so people know it's only sort of like not only the sandbox I have to play in, but that we want it. We want the ideas. We want it. Because sometimes without that, people feel as though I'm just doing what you told me what you wanted me to do.
And we have a question from Nicole who's been with us here. Maybe let's take a question to make it more interesting. Nicole, thanks for being with us. And so Nicole is saying this is a great conversation. Thank you, Nicole. And then her question: what resources would you recommend for someone to self-serve if they're looking to go from huge orgs to smaller startups to 5K in the people space, and therefore wear more hats around development processes, etc.?
Yeah, great question. I'm part of this community called Noetic, and it's a chief people officer. It's called CPOHQ, and Noetic is spelled Knoetic. It's a great platform with chief people officers in startups. People who are they're a head of HR of a team of one. They're the only HR person. Or they're smaller startups, and they're constantly sharing with each other practices, tips, things that they're doing on development or performance, new tools that are coming out. So I think resources, the first thing I think about in really great resources is your community. What community do you have that are sort of in situations similar to you? Because going from a 5,000 person company to a 500 person company, I need to be talking with CPOs who kind of understand that, or are also dealing with similar things. So I think that's the first thing is the communities that you're part of.
Thanks once again, Nicole, for being with us live and for asking this question. Hope you found the answer useful, valuable. And talking about learning and development, David, you've been now in the industry for quite some time, in people management, in HR. What's hot in the last couple of years when it comes to learning and development? Are there any specific skills that there is a bigger demand for, having in mind the whole infrastructure, how things are happening, all the post-pandemic trends and so on?
Yeah, I think kind of at the highest level, and this is not going to be new to anyone listening to this, but certainly, AI and sort of how we use artificial intelligence, how There's a new term called "Bring Your Own AI," BYOAI. Everyone who's listening to this, or everyone who's out in the community who's working right now, is probably in some level of transformation of how they work. Imagine a copywriter. Imagine an engineer. Engineers now can use a tool like it's called Devin, and they can just prompt Devin to say, like, hey, here's a technical challenge I'm facing, or here's something I want to create. Here's a website I want to create. And Devin generates the code that previously the engineer was supposed to generate themselves. And so understanding AI and how we can use it and how we can use AI to become higher performing, I think is a skill that we're all going to have to really grapple with. And I think that there's going to be a certain level percentage of every function where they don't want to do that. They want to continue working in a traditional sense, or they sort of dismiss the impact AI is going to have on their function. And so they're not keeping, sort of abreast of AI for their function. So I'll give you one more specific to my function. We're going to use AI to understand skill in the organization. So a company like Workera, will be able to assess, analyze the skills in your organization in engineering. What level of machine learning competency do our engineers have? A customer-oriented selling for our sales team by level. And then a company like maybe like a Sana or another learning development platform will be able to curate learning experiences to upskill. So back to your question, I think actually AI is going to affect learning and will affect skill. And there will be companies that actually assess this, will be assessing skill and then creating automated experiences to upskill in the organization. But I think the ground zero, I think for a lot of us, is really embracing that this is coming and immersing myself in it and actually starting to use it, starting to use Gemini, starting to use open source tools to just experiment with how I can use this in my own day to day. And the experiments will start simply, but then we'll actually start to transform and really create sort of outsized impact for each of us.
And we're recording this on 17th of May, 2024, and we just had the announcement earlier this week, right? The ChatGPT 4.0, all the new kind of AI tools. It's not going anywhere, and it's crazy how fast everything is evolving. So the sooner you can start playing with these things, even if it's not, ROI positive in the short term, this is something that you just have to be ready. That's for sure. But let's get back a little bit on the team building side, and the topic of the day: team of high performers, or VS high performing team. And what I would like to hear from you is if you can share maybe some specific examples and practices, because that's what people get inspired by, on what can we do to contribute to the team building. I'm going to share one example from one of our former podcast guests, who's the founder of a company called Lean Plum. One of the core practices that they had early in their development, but they keep this practice now during team of sites, and generally they do it on a monthly basis. I think they have big talk lunches, for example. So they want people to be, they realize that if people are friends, or like they build good relationship in between each other, they tend to perform better, they tend to stay longer in the company, because of course you want to be in this environment and so on. So they want to enhance this, and one way they did it was by organizing big talk lunches, meaning they'll put a marketing person, an IT person, and somebody else, and then they cover the cost for a lunch, and they'll send them together to lunch, and they give them a little bucket or something with where we can draw a question, and the question could be like a big talk question. Who was a mentor that contributed most to your career development, whatever. So they can choose to answer the question, so just to have lunch. But the main point is, we want people to spend more time together outside of work, so they can create better relationships and trust each other more. So I wonder if you have some examples on team building that you've seen over the years.
Yeah, I think what your example you're giving is really important. Relationships. I think Google's research on their highest performing teams, the number one attribute for high performing teams was psychological safety. And so what do we mean by that? Like, teams can challenge appropriately. They can challenge each other, and they're talking. They're having like really rich conversations, and they feel like they can do that. And so conversations that we have with each other, and certainly relationships and the trust that we build, sort of how we sort of know each other outside of work and as full humans, become really important to that. But building in a team, like we have a feedback culture. We give each other feedback, and we love it. We embrace it. We know how to do it really well. So one exercise we did at Niantic, we had an executive coach came in. I think we were struggling with having really the true conversations, like saying the thing that needed to be said.
Especially the tough ones, right? Especially the ones that want to improve.
Yeah. We had this difficulty with saying the things that needed to be said. And so this coach ran us through an exercise called Speedback. And so Speedback is you take your team of 5 or 10 or 15 or whatever. You can do it over Zoom. It's probably a little bit better if you do it in person. But everyone, so let's say there's 10-person team. I'm the 10th person. I get 9 3x5 note cards. And the night before the exercise, I'm just going to write down on one side a strength that I think that person brings that is invaluable to the team. And on the other side, an opportunity or development area or a weakness that person displays that is affecting the team. And you can be ready to give an example. And so Speedback is like speed dating. So the person who's facilitating sets up these, sort of the ground rules, like, hey, sort of seek to understand, be comfortable, sort of say thank you at the end, so set up some ground rules. But then over the course of an hour and a half, everyone sits down with each other. So there's two chairs, and there's five sets of chairs or whatever. And we sit down, and you and I are sitting down, and so I go first, and I'm going to have 3 to 5 minutes to share with you. Here's the strength that I think that you're bringing, and then here's the opportunity, and then I give my example, and the other person says thank you, and then the other person goes, and it can feel like if you've ever done Soul Cycle, like a really difficult exercise or workout. It can feel really difficult, particularly if we're not used to this. And I'm giving you something really direct. And I have to maybe tell you something I've never told you before, and I got to tell you this, but I'm doing it in relative privacy here in our chair off to the side of the room. And then everyone else is doing it too. So there's these conversations going on. And at the end of it, everyone has these notes and we're drained. We're just like, wow, that was really difficult. But I'm just like, my eyes are sort of wide open. And I share openly with the group. We sit in a circle. David, share what I learned. Here's what I heard. Here's some things on what people appreciate about me. But here's a thing that I heard pretty consistently that I need to be aware of and I need to work on. And everyone nods their head. And so it's incredibly important to trust building, to building conversation and building a feedback culture, which I think is really vital to that psychological safety thing.
Oh, it's a great exercise, man. Also the fact that you finish the exercise. Initially, it's a one-on-one, right? So people are kind of feeling safe to share, not in front of the group. You don't know where it's coming from, but then you take ownership to share. These are the areas I need to work on. So you make a public commitment, and
yeah,
it's great, man.
You create sunlight. You create sunlight on the thing. Yeah.
And team offsites are also a great way to bring people out of the office and achieve certain outcomes. How do you design company team offsites? Like what do you think of, when you're looking into how do we design it so it serves the purpose? What are the kind of things you would look for an effective team offsite?
Yeah, offsites are a great opportunity for strategy alignment, to go deep in particular areas. When you have your weekly 1 hour exec team meeting, or your sort of management team meeting, or your 1 hour or 30-minute one-on-ones, it's hard to go deep. We're just so living in sort of the moment of what we need to focus on this week. Your offsite is your opportunity to go deep. So we have an offsite next week in New York. The executive team are going to get together. We're going to talk about our 2-year plan. We're going to talk about what are we focusing on the next 2 years. We're going to talk about leadership principles. So we're going to hone our leadership principles at Flare. What do we want to see? So I think about offsites where if we have the ability, we have the T&E budget, we have the luxury of being able to get a group together for 2 days, if you will.
What is the size of the group? If it's not
this group next week is 5 or 6 people. We've also done offsites of like upwards of 20 people for a leadership team. Teams will sometimes get together. Whole teams, like a whole function, will get together. We have an office in Scottsdale and Tel Aviv and New York, and they'll sometimes get together. But generally, to answer your question, we want to pick the areas where, like, hey, if we had 2 days together in live in real life, where do we want to go deep? But then also, what do we hope? What are the outcomes? So I think sometimes this is where offsite sometimes become a little bit of a waste, where we have a great conversation, but we didn't have clarity on the outcomes we were hoping for, and we didn't have our story coming out of this that we can sort of craft and share with others who didn't get to sit in this. So I think understanding what your outcomes are, understanding what sort of decisions that we're seeking in the offsite, if we were seeking any decisions at all, but being outcome oriented. Now the outcome could be, hey, part of this we just want to do some team building. So part of it, like, we want to, like, for 4 hours one day, we're just going to try and do that speedback thing. We're just going to try and build the culture of our team. The other part of it is our strategy, and we're going to try and come up with a 2 years. So, but being really mindful of what outcomes you're seeking in the agenda is also key.
This is of the heart of this podcast, man. The mindset is whatever it is you are after, you want to get clear what's the desired outcome, and then you build it backwards. In anything you do, with your culture, with your team offsite, with your vacation personally, what do you want to get out of it? And now that you're clear, these 7 different potential outcomes, what is the most important one? This one, okay, great. How do we design a team offsite? What do we put in it? Like, maybe we can't put all these, leadership development workshops, because you need some space for, the group to breathe and to have this. I mean, but then you start from the end in mind, right? But I want to kind of zoom in a little bit. You mentioned maybe we align on our leadership principles, and I kind of like how it sounds, and I'm guessing this is something to do with the company values or philosophies. Like, what do you mean by leadership principles?
Well, so in some companies you might have an orientation at the top where it's a top down, it's command and control. So, or you might have a leader who's come from a company. Let's just say someone who's come from Amazon and who spent 10 years at Amazon, but they're coming to a company with a culture is very harmony oriented. There's some misalignment there, and so particularly as you bring on new leaders, or as you develop your values, there becomes then a sort of a general sort of way that we're leading that maybe we've never examined before. And how are we leading? So you could say, hey, these are our values. But how do we lead? How do we lead? Are we top down? Are we servant leadership style? Are we command and control? Are we consensus oriented? How do we sort of deal with debate and discussion? But generally, you're looking for principles around sort of like, hey, when we're really effective as leaders, these are the things that we're displaying, and then tactically, how do those show up? How do we build those muscles? So I think for us, we just realized we've never examined this before. And so we want to sort of craft some principles and have a debate and discussion around it. Some of it is a little bit less important to sort of get the 5 right or get the 7 right. And what do they actually mean? Because there's going to be some level of vagueness in them. But ideally, yes, they probably coincide with the values. I mean, we can look at these things and, hey, these are not in conflict with our values, right? So how we're leading. But they might be in conflict. They might be in conflict for how we sort of think about our people, how we think about trust, how we think about psychological safety, how we think about our role as leaders, telling people what to do versus trusting them, as an example, might be in conflict with the values. But for us, we want to have a discussion around this to make sure that we're aligned on this. We can kind of also share the story with the next level of leaders in the company, and that we also know where we think we're weak on some of these principles, where we actually don't display certain leadership principles all the time, where we have trouble and how that shows up, and then what we can do about it.
I love it, man. On the one side is kind of the alignment points. What are the principles that we kind of agree on to follow? But on the other side, everybody is a little bit different as a personality, right? So the leadership style is not going to be exactly the same. The introverted leader versus the super extroverted kind of person that's a visionary might have a different style, but then the principles are probably going to be similar. We did an exercise recently. My team and I have this practice, which I would recommend, by the way, to everybody who can afford the resource, the time to do that. Every week we have a practice called the Personal Development Hour, and it could be anything. It's an hour to 90 minutes in which either I will lead a session, somebody from the team will lead a session, or we'll get an external person. which could be connected to something, work-wise, or it could be just connected to personal development, journaling, time management,
Love it.
mentoring, well-being. So we had one session which was about these 10 leadership styles.
Mm,
You have the authoritative, delegative, coaching, servant leadership, like all these kind of leadership styles. So we explored them together, and then everybody had to pick what are the three that come most natural to you, and
hmm
what is one that you feel like you should work on. And then everybody also was sharing feedback to the others, and I found it really meaningful because
hmm
we got to learn so much about each other, and sometimes also the appreciation, because your colleague are telling
Yeah.
you you're extremely good in the coaching thing. Like, really? So this type of conversations rarely happen, but when they do, they're so valuable.
So valuable. Yeah, it reminds me of this idea of convergence. So I think everyone's going to have a slightly different style. Leadership. Everyone's have a slightly different stylistic. But what we believe about people, what we sort of want to sort of display as a team, how we want to show up as a leadership team, how we generally want to lead, what we think, what we expect of others, I think is important. And I think it aligns to this topic of convergence. And a great article, Leader's Guide to Corporate Culture, it's related to an HBR article called The Culture Factor from 3 some odd years ago. It's really shaped how I think about the role of leaders in shaping culture and leadership principles and such. One of the big outcomes of this research that they did in this article they talk about is that they say there's maybe 8 different types of company cultures. There's results oriented, there's learning oriented, there's empathy based. So they have these 5, and you can plot Tesla's over here, and Whole Foods is over here, and Disney is over here. And what's important, what they found is it doesn't matter what type of culture you ultimately have. It doesn't matter in terms of like which culture is better in terms of productivity, profits, customer outcomes, et cetera. What matters is convergence. So meaning in the company, do we all, if I asked the average employee in the elevator and describe the culture at the company, are they generally saying something that is mostly similar? Or are they kind of all over the place? The finance team says this thing, the engineering team kind of says these things over here, and like the Singapore office says this, and so lack of convergence is resulted to bad outcomes in terms of profits and customer outcomes. But convergence is related to good outcomes. So I think that aligns, that sort of links up to the sort of generally like sort of how we lead.
That is so good, man. That is so good. And I don't want to finish on the sort of like on the negative, but I just want to ask you one more question. And this is from your experience in so many years. If you can kind of name top 3 things, what are the top 3 things that make employees disengage? And what can we do about it? If we can kind of wrap up shortly with this answer. I know it's a long answer probably, but
Yeah. Well, so engagement generally follows a curve. It's just the thing I started with is, your engagement. This is research from Gallup and elsewhere, but in the first 6 months, your engagement is going up. And then between 6 months to about 3 years, your engagement is going down. And then it rebounds. So if I stick around long enough, it starts to rebound. It actually starts to go back up. But in that 6 months to 2 to 3 years mark, what's happening? Like, why am I disengaging? Things are changing. My boss left. I'm asked to do something different. What I came here to do is no longer important. I don't feel like I'm learning. So generally, when I see things that are disengaging, when I see people disengaging, there's something's changing, and we're not aware of it as managers, and we're not digging in with the individual to make sure that you're still motivated. So there's an exercise called the motivational pie chart from Jen Dulsky, which I think is really great to sort of counteract that disengagement thing, and you can do that every 6 months. But as you understand that, it's like I don't feel like I'm learning and growing here. I don't feel like the work that I'm doing is meaningful, and the relationship that I have with my boss or my team, it's no longer satisfactory to me. So the manager plays a really important role there, but I think there's other things in there as well. Learning and growing, the work that I'm doing feels meaningful, and I feel like I'm having a rewarding relationship with my team and my manager.
this is such a great way to finish, to wrap up this episode and to leave everyone, myself included, in a little bit of food for thought. So thank you so much, David. Final words, anything you want to share about the company? Maybe you guys are putting out some positions out there or launching a new product. Like the floor is yours.
Yeah.
Anything you would like to share?
Gosh, we're trying to hire some really great full cycle sales talent in our
Okay,
Scottsdale office, and
LinkedIn, listen carefully. Listen
yeah.
carefully what David has to offer.
Yeah, if by chance you're in the Scottsdale area and you're in a sales capacity, we're trying to hire some really great sales talent in our Scottsdale office, trying to hire some really great engineers in our Tel Aviv in our engineering office. But I think also as a company, we're in an exciting space. We're in legal tech space. So reach out to me. Feel free to connect with me. I love to sort of share learnings and interact with people on LinkedIn. But yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, David, and thanks everybody for making it to the end of the episode. Episode 183, meaning there's 122 more episodes like this with amazing people talking about culture, leadership, entrepreneurship. So make sure to subscribe to Productivity Mastery on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or any other favorite podcast platform. Thanks once again, and let's keep performing.